She wasn't just a queen, she was Egypt's final heartbeat. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, wasn't remembered just for her beauty or her romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She was remembered because she dared to fight a crumbling empire with nothing but her mind, her voice, and her will. In a world ruled by men and war, Cleopatra stood alone, as a strategist, a lover, and a symbol of resistance. Before Rome swallowed Egypt whole, she gave the world a final glimpse of what it meant to be truly powerful, truly brilliant, and truly unforgettable. Welcome to our channel, where forgotten legends come back to life. Today, we dive deep into the unbelievable, emotional, and reality-based story of Cleopatra VII, the last true pharaoh of Egypt. From a queen in exile to a ruler who outmaneuvered the world's greatest generals, Cleopatra's life was filled with love, war, betrayal, and unstoppable willpower. If you love real history that feels like a movie, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and drop a comment telling us what surprised you most about her legacy. Now, let's uncover the woman behind the crown. Still, she bided her time. She knew she could not ascend too early. Her father, though weak, held the title, and though the people despised him, he was still the bridge to the future. When rebellion broke out against Ptolemy XII in 58 BCE, Cleopatra was barely 11 years old. Her father was driven into exile, and her older sister Berenice seized the throne. It was the first real taste Cleopatra had of the chaos that awaited a power vacuum. For 3 years, she watched from the side as her sister ruled and her father begged Rome for restoration. And when Rome finally obliged, in exchange for further debt and submission, Ptolemy returned with Roman military support. Berenice was executed, her followers slaughtered, and Cleopatra, now in her mid-teens, saw up close what betrayal meant and what victory demanded. By the time Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was 18. She had spent her childhood watching kings fall and queens murdered, listening to Roman threats, and reading Egyptian poetry. She had survived exile, court intrigue, and the wrath of a father desperate to keep his throne at any cost. Now, the throne was hers, but not hers alone. In keeping with Ptolemaic custom, she was forced to marry her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, only 10 years old. The co-rule was symbolic, but the power was real, and the boy king was a puppet in the hands of corrupt advisors who would soon turn against her. Yet Cleopatra was not afraid. She had waited her whole life for this moment, and though the challenges ahead would be many, exile again, war, Caesar, Antony, and the fall of Egypt itself, she had already been tempered by fire. The child of 69 BCE, born in the dying light of a fading kingdom, was now a queen forged by knowledge, scarred by betrayal, and armed with a vision that would outlast empires. The year was 51 BCE, and the heat over Alexandria was more than just the fire of the desert sun. It was the smoldering breath of history about to shift. Cleopatra VII Philopator, now just 18 years old, stood on the trembling threshold between princess and queen, between a nation's burden and her own uncertain destiny. Her father, Ptolemy XII Elites, had finally died after years of exile, disgrace, and humiliating subservience to Rome. The man who had clung to the throne through bribes and betrayal now lay wrapped in linen and ritual silence. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long since traded greatness for survival, but Cleopatra, sharp-eyed, educated, intuitive, had no intention of walking the same crumbling path. With her father's death, the weight of the kingdom fell not upon one set of shoulders, but two. As was custom and curse of the Ptolemaic line, Cleopatra was named co-ruler alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of just 10 years. To solidify their bond and supposedly stabilize the line, the two were married, as had become the dynasty's dark tradition. But a throne divided is never truly shared, and a throne between a woman and a boy is never silent. Even in the earliest days of her rule, Cleopatra felt the cold sting of daggers hidden in royal silk. The court was a nest of vipers. Ptolemy XIII was but a puppet for the palace regents and advisors, particularly the cunning eunuch Pothinus and the scheming general Achilles. They viewed Cleopatra's intellect and autonomy as threats, not merely because she was a woman, but because she would not bend. She did not flatter the Romans who came bearing threats and treaties. She did not entertain the flatterers of the court. She did not smile when deceit was dressed in diplomacy. Cleopatra had already proven in her girlhood that she was unlike her siblings, unlike her father, unlike any woman to have sat on Egypt's throne since the days of Isis herself. And so, they plotted to silence her. What began as whispers turned into commands, and what began as cold shoulders turned into war rooms. Within a year of co-ruling, Cleopatra found herself increasingly pushed out of power, her name omitted from decrees, her authority mocked in court, and her presence met with calculated exclusion. The soft betrayal of politics soon turned violent. Fearing assassination, Cleopatra fled Alexandria under the cover of night in 49 BCE, taking only her closest allies and what little military support she could summon from loyal provinces. She left behind the marble halls she had grown up in, the palace gardens where she once dreamed, and a city that had watched queens rise and fall with less ceremony than the changing of the Nile's tide. Exile did not break her. It forged her. From the eastern desert and the city of Pelusium, Cleopatra mounted her resistance, not only against her brother's regents, but against the complacency that had doomed her ancestors. She understood now that her crown could not be inherited. It had to be seized. Meanwhile, the Roman Republic was in flames. Civil war had erupted between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, and as fate would have it, both generals turned their eyes toward Egypt, a wealthy, strategic prize in their contest for supremacy. Pompey, fleeing from defeat at Pharsalus, arrived at Egypt's shores in desperation, hoping for sanctuary. But the advisors of Ptolemy XIII, believing they could win favor with Caesar, offered Pompey not comfort, but betrayal. They welcomed him with silence and swords, executing him on the beach in cold blood. His head was presented to Caesar days later in Alexandria, a grotesque offering meant to please the most powerful man in the world. But Caesar was not pleased. The assassination of a Roman consul and former ally, on foreign soil, by the hands of a child king, was not political genius. It was insult. Cleopatra, watching this chaos from the outskirts, saw her opportunity. She knew Caesar had come to Egypt to restore order, to settle debts, and to assert Roman dominance, but she also knew he was a man drawn to charisma, intellect, and strength wrapped in elegance. So she gambled everything. In one of the most legendary entrances in all of history, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace, hidden within a rolled carpet, or some say a sack of linen. When Caesar's servants unrolled it at his feet, out tumbled not a beggar or a queen in mourning, but a living flame, 21 years old, dressed in elegance, speaking not as a victim, but as a ruler. That moment changed everything. Caesar saw not only the rightful queen of Egypt, but a mirror of himself, someone who had been exiled, betrayed, underestimated, and had come back sharper than before. What followed was not simply seduction, as so many lesser historians would claim. It was strategy, laced with mutual awe. Cleopatra and Caesar were bound not only by desire, but by vision. They spoke of politics late into the night, of astronomy, of legacy, of power. She showed him the truth of Egypt, and he offered her the might of Rome. Caesar declared his support for Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and thus the Alexandrian War erupted, a brutal civil conflict fought not for land, but for legitimacy. Cleopatra stood at the center of it all, not in hiding, but in armor, in councils, in every whispered decision. She was no longer a queen in exile, she was a warrior of circumstance. Her brother's forces, commanded by Achilles, clashed with Caesar's Roman legions in Alexandria's very streets. The city burned. The great library was rumored to have caught flame. Blood ran where scholars once walked. In the end, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during his retreat, his crown floating downstream, his death as small and cruel as his rule had been. Victory was not just survival, it was transformation. Cleopatra re-entered Alexandria not as a dependent of Rome, but as a co-equal in empire building. She was reinstated as queen, now alongside her even younger brother Ptolemy XIV, merely for ceremonial purposes. But everyone knew the truth. Cleopatra ruled alone. Not long after, she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known as Caesarion. Though Caesar never publicly acknowledged the child, Cleopatra named him with pride. He was both a symbol of love and an heir to empires. Her reign stabilized in the wake of the war. Egypt's debts were managed. The economy flourished, and the people, who had once whispered against her lineage, now saw in her the first ruler in generations who did not rule through fear, but through brilliance. She did not hide behind priests or generals. She stood before her people, speaking in their tongue, worshipping their gods, and wearing their symbols. To many, she was not just queen, she was the living Isis. But peace with Rome was always temporary. Cleopatra knew this. She journeyed to Rome in 46 BCE, sailing up the Tiber with her son and a full royal entourage. There, she stayed in Caesar's villa, outside the city walls. Her presence caused a storm. The senators were appalled, the Roman matrons scandalized, and Caesar's enemies sharpened their blades. Still, Cleopatra held her head high. She was not there to play concubine. She was there to be seen, to be recognized, to remind the world that Egypt had not fallen. Yet even the sharpest rulers cannot outmaneuver every blade. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor. The world shifted again, and with it, Cleopatra's future darkened. Rome descended into new wars. Caesars will named Octavian, not Caesarion, as heir. And Cleopatra, once again, sailed back to Alexandria not in triumph, but in mourning. But the woman who returned was no longer the girl exiled at 18. She was the monarch of her own legend now, hardened by betrayal, sharpened by war, and crowned not by inheritance, but by fire. Cleopatra's rise to power in 51 BCE was not a single moment, but a crucible of constant survival. She had faced exile, civil war, and the whims of empire, and emerged not as a casualty, but as a queen etched into history. In her, Egypt found its last breath of sovereignty, its final queen who ruled not through lineage, but through will. Her enemies called her dangerous. Her allies called her divine. And history would remember her as the last pharaoh, not just of Egypt, but of a dying world where gods walked with mortals and power was earned through passion, intellect, and the courage to never yield. The winds of change stirred across the Mediterranean in 48 BC, but in Alexandria, they howled like fate breathing down the walls of palaces that once stood as sanctuaries of divine rule. Cleopatra VII, exiled from her own throne by the hands of her own blood, wandered in the sands of the eastern desert, not broken but burning, burning with the embers of betrayal, the sting of abandonment, and the sharp taste of unfinished destiny. She had not left her beloved Alexandria by choice. The court she had ruled with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII had turned against her. What began as a fragile co-regency had quickly crumbled into a brutal struggle for control, one manipulated by men who saw Cleopatra's intelligence and independence as threats rather than strengths. Her brother, still a boy, was but a mask for the real puppeteers, regents and generals who feared a woman with a voice, a woman who did not kneel, a woman who dared to rule Egypt as an Egyptian, not just as a Greek queen. And so, she had been cast out of the very city where she had learned to walk, to read, to dream, and to lead. But even in exile, Cleopatra remained a storm waiting to rise. She was not a queen lost. She was a queen returning. As Cleopatra gathered her loyal supporters in Syria and raised an army to reclaim her throne, a different fire was igniting across the sea. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart. Julius Caesar had pursued his rival Pompey the Great into Greece, winning a brutal and decisive battle at Pharsalus. Pompey, broken and desperate, fled to Egypt seeking refuge, unaware that his doom had already arrived ahead of him. The regents of Egypt, seeking to curry favor with Caesar, invited Pompey ashore under the guise of sanctuary, and then murdered him before he could set foot safely on land. His severed head was delivered to Caesar like a perverse gift, a grotesque offering meant to align Egypt with Rome's rising power. But Caesar, a man of ambition but also of strange loyalties, was not pleased. The bloodied head of a Roman consul did not inspire his respect. It enraged him. It insulted his sense of order, of dignity, of the Roman ideal that even enemies deserved the respect of fate. And it summoned the storm that would bring Cleopatra back to Alexandria. Not quietly, not in chains, but as a queen wrapped in myth. She had watched this game unfold from afar, her mind moving faster than armies could march. She knew that if she could reach Caesar before her brother's regents did, she could offer something Pompey's killers never could: intelligence, alignment, charisma, and a vision of Egypt that Caesar might find useful, or even irresistible. But to reach Caesar was to gamble with everything she had. Her army, still forming, was not yet ready for open battle. Her support in Alexandria had been silenced or slaughtered. Her presence in the city was forbidden. But Cleopatra had never believed in waiting for permission. She had herself smuggled back into Alexandria under the cover of night, carried by a single servant across the sea and into the royal palace. According to legend, and history remembers it not only because it is strange, but because it feels like something only Cleopatra could have done, she had herself rolled into a rug or linen sack, then carried directly into Caesar's private quarters. When it was unfurled, there she stood, not humbled, not ashamed, but radiant, poised, and utterly calm. A woman who had lost everything, yet still carried herself like a goddess. Julius Caesar, hardened by war and power, did not see a refugee when he saw Cleopatra. He saw a reflection. They were both beings forged in betrayal, crowned by ambition, and obsessed with legacy. Cleopatra did not plead for help. She reasoned. She argued. She danced with words and history. She spoke to Caesar as an equal, and for the first time in months, perhaps even years, he met someone who did not tremble before him. She promised him not only loyalty, but stability, not only beauty, but brilliance. She reminded him that Egypt was not merely a vassal state, but the granary of Rome, the mouth of the Nile, the last truly independent jewel left in a world Rome had devoured. Her voice was soft, her gaze unblinking. Caesar, who had commanded legions, who had crossed the Rubicon, who had seen empires rise and fall under his hand, found in Cleopatra not a distraction but a challenge. He chose to support her claim to the throne. But support from Caesar was not a quiet endorsement. It was a declaration of war. The regents of Ptolemy XIII were furious. The city erupted in chaos. Cleopatra's brother, manipulated by his handlers, called his army to arms. The palace turned into a battleground. Roman troops loyal to Caesar clashed with Egyptian forces loyal to the boy king. The people of Alexandria, already weary, already poor, already suspicious of Rome's hand, found themselves trapped in a civil war that tore through their streets and marketplaces. This was no symbolic conflict. It was blood on marble. It was fires in temples. The city screamed under the weight of history being made. And Cleopatra, rather than flee again, stood by Caesar's side. She did not hide in the women's quarters or behind royal veils. She was present in every decision, every maneuver, every risk. Her survival no longer depended on favor. It depended on fire. This was the Alexandrian War, and its battles were not fought only with swords. They were fought in narrow alleys, in sudden ambushes, on the docks where grain ships burned. It was fought in desperation, with both sides lacking reinforcements, both sides gambling everything. Cleopatra's life was targeted directly. Assassins were sent. Plots were formed. But each time, the queen evaded death, not through magic, but through the same intelligence and instinct that had brought her this far. Rome sent reinforcements to Caesar, just enough to turn the tide. In a final confrontation near the Nile, Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee, but drowned in the river that had once been the source of his crown. His body was recovered days later, bloated and silent. His death did not end the conflict, but it ended the illusion that Cleopatra could be overthrown. She emerged from the war-scarred, but sovereign. Alexandria smoldered, and its people mourned the dead, but many now looked to Cleopatra with a new kind of respect. She had not been restored by foreign force alone. She had stood with Caesar, but not beneath him. Her mind had won this war as much as his legions. Her brother was gone. Another, even younger, was raised nominally to co-rule beside her, Ptolemy XIV, but it was a gesture made only for show. Cleopatra was, in truth and in form, queen. She wasted no time. Her rule began not with celebration, but with reconstruction. She stabilized the treasury. She reformed taxation. She re-established alliances with provinces that had drifted during the chaos. And as she governed, she carried within her the future, literally. For she was pregnant with Caesar's child, a boy who would be named Caesarion. It is impossible to say whether she loved Caesar as a man or as a myth, but she recognized that their union had birthed not just a child, but a symbol, a bridge between Rome and Egypt, between gods and men, between what was and what could be. The months following the war were quiet, but never peaceful. Cleopatra's enemies were silent, but not gone. Rome watched her with fascination and fear. Caesar's Rome was not yet Augustus's empire. It was a fragile republic that didn't yet know how to handle a foreign queen who ruled without apology. Cleopatra wore the robes of Isis in public ceremonies, declaring herself not merely mortal, but divine. To her people, she was more than just a ruler, she was Egypt itself. To the rest of the world, she was now a figure too large to ignore. And still, she walked the palace grounds with the same calm strength, aware that though the war was over, her story had just begun. Her journey from exile to throne had not broken her. It had shaped her into the kind of queen history cannot forget, not because she was perfect, but because she endured. 48 BC was not just the year Cleopatra returned. It was the year the world began to change because of her. A girl once cast out by her own court had stood beside the greatest general of the age and reshaped the fate of her kingdom. In the ruins of battle, she built a legacy. In the arms of power, she carried a future. And in the silence after war, Cleopatra VII stood, not as a pawn of men, not as a mistress of Rome, but as a monarch in her own right. The Nile once again ran through her hands, and the history of the world would never flow the same way again. In the ashless silence that followed the Alexandrian War, when the last screams had faded into memory and the smoke of a burning city drifted toward the sea, Cleopatra VII stood alone in the ruins of a crown she had bled to reclaim. It was 47 BCE, and she was no longer the exiled queen hiding behind veils and diplomacy, nor merely the ambitious daughter of a dynasty rotting from within. She was now the absolute ruler of Egypt, not by inheritance, but by fire. Her enemies lay drowned, scattered, exiled. Her brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII, had died as he had lived, grasping for a power he was too young to wield, his body fished from the muddy Nile, swollen and anonymous in the tide. His death brought no joy, only necessity. Cleopatra had seen too much war to romanticize the cost of victory. Alexandria, her beloved city of knowledge, trade, and elegance, had been violated in the chaos, its streets stained with blood, its harbor choked with debris, and its people haunted by the presence of Roman legions who had fought not to conquer, but to enforce their new alliance. Yet amid the wreckage, Cleopatra felt the undeniable pulse of rebirth. She had not only survived the storm, but had become the storm's eye, calm yet commanding, quietly reshaping the very fabric of Egyptian rule. Her first act was to name her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, co-regent, not from sentiment, but strategy. He was only 12, malleable and politically unthreatening. He would wear the title, she would wield the power. Cleopatra's palace, still echoing with the ghost of battle, transformed once again into the center of Egyptian sovereignty. But even as she rebuilt, repainted, and replanted, she carried within her the most fragile symbol of both her legacy and her greatest gamble, a child. Conceived during her brief but world-shifting alliance with Julius Caesar, this unborn child was not simply a royal heir but a lightning rod for speculation, scandal, and danger. Cleopatra, ever aware of the optics of power, did not hide her pregnancy. She walked among her people in ceremonial processions, the growing curve of her belly visible beneath her robes of Isis, daring the world to question what her body meant for history. Her son, she knew, would change everything. If Caesar acknowledged him, and even if he did not, the child would be a fusion of East and West, of Egypt and Rome, of dynasty and republic. As she awaited the birth, she began laying the groundwork for a future in which her bloodline would no longer be tethered to fragile treaties or Greek corruption but to a vision of a renewed Egypt, sovereign yet modern, loyal yet unbowed. She resumed state functions not with extravagance but with precision. Temples were repaired, taxes reassessed, and trade reopened. The floodgates of the Nile, watched like omens by farmers and priests alike, opened in accordance with ancient rituals, and the city slowly exhaled. Cleopatra, unlike her predecessors, engaged directly with her people, not as a distant deity, but as a living emblem of continuity. She spoke fluent Egyptian, a rarity among Ptolemies, and her public appearances were deliberate and symbolic. She prayed at the temple of Isis, not as a queen pretending, but as one believed to be the goddess reborn. In private, the walls of the palace whispered with other stories of her Roman lover who had returned to his fractured homeland, where senators sharpened their blades with jealousy and fear. Julius Caesar had left Egypt with a scent of both triumph and trouble clinging to his robes. Though victorious, he returned to a Rome suspicious of his entanglement with a foreign queen and uneasy about his consolidation of power. Cleopatra did not delude herself into thinking his affection would shield her from Roman suspicion, but she also knew he was not a man to forget ambition or loyalty. Their son would be her anchor to him, whether Rome liked it or not. In the early summer of 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a boy, Ptolemy 15 Philopator Philometor Caesar, but she would call him Caesarion, Little Caesar. The labor was long, but she did not scream. To scream, she felt, would betray the image she had so carefully forged. Instead, she gave birth with the same fierce silence she had maintained while armies clashed outside her window only months before. The midwives wept, the priests chanted, and when they placed the infant in her arms, Cleopatra did not smile. She studied his face as if searching for omens, looking into the future, not for innocence, but for strength. She saw in him not a child, but a dynasty reborn. His blood carried the venom of Rome and the eternity of Egypt. He was, in her mind, not just her son but her second chance, her response to a world that had tried to erase her. As Caesarion's birth spread across Alexandria, the city came alive with cautious awe. Poets penned hymns to his divinity. Merchants whispered that Rome and Egypt were now bound by flesh. The temples interpreted his arrival as the fulfillment of prophecy. Isis had borne Horus again, and the two lands would be united in peace. Cleopatra leaned into this mythology, not out of superstition, but out of politics. She commissioned new statues, coins, and artwork that portrayed her not merely as queen, but as mother of the divine. Caesarion appeared beside her in murals, a radiant child with a cobra crown and a Roman cloak. Yet beneath the public displays of holiness, Cleopatra worked with relentless focus. She reshaped the administration of justice, overhauled taxation, and personally mediated disputes between local governors and priests. She summoned foreign ambassadors and hosted them in opulence, not as a show of decadence, but of order restored. Every step she took was a message. Egypt was not Rome's playground, nor a fading relic. It was reborn, and it had teeth. Still, she did not rule with cruelty. Cleopatra was feared, but she was also admired. Her rule marked a subtle golden age of cultural revival, scientific pursuit, and religious harmony. Scholars returned to the Library of Alexandria. Farmers, emboldened by fair grain policies, returned to their fields. Priests, once pawns in courtly games, found new support and patronage. And women, especially noble women, looked to their queen with something like reverence. In a world where a woman's voice was often ignored or suppressed, Cleopatra not only spoke, she commanded. She held court with confidence, flanked by advisors who knew better than to speak over her. Foreign dignitaries left Egypt not merely impressed, but recalibrated, unsure of how to frame a woman who ruled with more tact than kings and more strategy than generals. She wore no armor, but every word was a weapon, every glance a chess move. She did not need Caesar at her side to be powerful, but she welcomed the image of their bond because it unsettled the Roman order and reinforced her own. The world may have assumed that her rise was Caesar's doing, but she knew the truth. Her reign was her own crucible. In Rome, her name became legend and insult, often in the same breath. Senators spat her name in envy, while poets sang of her allure. She became the embodiment of Rome's anxiety, both its desire for the East and its fear of losing dominance. Cleopatra did not care for their opinions, only their outcomes. She wrote frequently to Caesar, sending gifts, messages, and subtle reminders that his son grew stronger by the day. He responded sparingly, but with enough warmth to reassure her. She planned carefully for the possibility that Caesarion might one day inherit both thrones, or neither. She commissioned his education with Greek tutors and Egyptian priests. He would know both worlds, she vowed, and master them. As her son grew in the nursery, she never stopped planning. She reorganized trade with Cyprus and Crete, negotiated with Parthian envoys, and reinforced Egyptian naval strength. She hosted festivals honoring Isis and Osiris, not only to stir spiritual unity, but to remind the people that their ruler was divine, destined, irreplaceable. She did not ask for loyalty. She commanded it through grace and strength. But even as she ruled, she felt the tremors of the wider world. News from Rome filtered through envoys and merchants, Caesar consolidating power, declaring himself dictator for life, enemies gathering in whispers, omens of thunder in the Republic's dying breath. Cleopatra knew that Caesar's fate would soon intertwine fatally with hers. If he fell, Egypt would face the storm alone again. But if he rose further, her place in the new empire would be solidified, not as a subject, but as a partner. She did not share these fears aloud. To her court, she remained unshaken. To her people, she remained the Nile's living embodiment. But in the late hours, she walked alone through the palace colonnades, her footsteps echoing like quiet prayers, and watched the stars, not for comfort, but calculation. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra stood not only at the height of her power, but at the edge of history's deepest divide. She had endured exile, civil war, and scorn. She had borne a son who might become emperor or martyr. She had turned a shattered kingdom into a shimmering court of ambition. And she had done it not with armies, but with mind and heart. To those who watched from Rome, she was a threat in gold and silk. To her people, she was a goddess with a human soul. And to herself, she was simply what she had always been, a woman born in chaos, built for the storm, and determined to carve her name into time not with blood alone, but with brilliance. The world would remember Cleopatra, but in 47 BCE, she was not yet legend. She was still living it. The year 44 BCE began not in silence, but with the echoes of anticipation, an unease that seeped into the marble columns of Rome, a city trying to convince itself it still knew what order meant. But to Cleopatra VII, sovereign of Egypt and high priestess of her own survival, Rome was never just a city. It was the storm her life orbited. And now, for the first time, she entered it not as myth or rumor, but as flesh, blood, and power incarnate. Her arrival was no procession of drums or flags, but it resounded across the city like a tremor. She had sailed from Alexandria with Caesarion in her arms, the child whose very existence was political dynamite, accompanied by a royal entourage that reeked of incense, silk, and unreadable intent. Rome had never seen a woman like Cleopatra. She was not a visiting ally or a foreign dignitary. She was a queen who made no apologies for her place in the world, a ruler who walked with the grace of divinity, but the calculations of a general. The Roman people watched her with a mix of wonder, suspicion, and resentment. To the elite, she was the embodiment of everything Rome feared: foreign, powerful, intelligent, and tied to their most unpredictable leader, Julius Caesar. And to Caesar himself, Cleopatra was more than a consort. She was a mirror, a reminder of what legacy meant when it bled across borders and time. They met in secret and in public, both of them aware that the eyes of the Republic followed their every breath. Caesar, now dictator for life, had made Rome his stage, but Cleopatra was the shadow behind the curtain. Her presence challenged every tradition the Senate held dear. She stayed in a villa on the Janiculum Hill, outside the sacred city limits, as no monarch was allowed inside the Pomerium, but her absence within the walls did not stop her presence from invading every Roman conversation. Rumors spiraled like smoke that Caesar planned to make her queen of Rome, that he would legitimize Caesarion as his heir, that the age of the Republic was dying and Cleopatra's Egypt would replace it with gold, silk, and sun gods. The Senate seethed. Friends turned enemies. Enemies turned conspirators. But Cleopatra did not flinch. She moved through this world of togas and betrayal with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived worse. She attended private gatherings, held audiences with Roman women who had never seen a queen in full regalia, and spoke in a Latin laced with careful elegance. She made no declarations, but her silence was eloquent. She was the foreign queen Rome could not ignore, and her child, Caesarion, became the question no one dared answer. Did he belong to Caesar? Was he the true heir? Cleopatra did not confirm, but neither did she deny. Her presence was her confirmation. The boy bore Caesar's eyes, his curls, his chin. Rome could draw its own conclusions. But March came, and with it the end of delusions. On the 15th day of that month, under the marble rotunda of the Theater of Pompey, Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed 23 times by men he had once called brothers: Brutus, Cassius, Casca. Their blades carved not just flesh, but the heart of the Republic's uncertain future. When word reached Cleopatra, the sound was not a shout or a cry. It was silence, the kind that rots through bone. Caesar was dead. Her protector, her partner, the father of her son. His blood had pooled at the feet of Pompey's statue, and with it died every plan they had forged in quiet. Rome exploded. Riots tore through the streets. The Senate froze. The conspirators fled. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, delivered the funeral oration to a city drunk on rage and confusion. Cleopatra, within her villa, said nothing. She did not appear in public. She did not cry. She held Caesarion in her arms and whispered words that no historian would ever record. What she felt in those days, grief, fear, rage, betrayal, can only be guessed. But what is known is that she did not run. Not at first. She watched. She waited. She listened as Rome tore itself apart trying to decide what Caesar's death meant. And in the ashes, she began to rebuild her next move. The senators debated what to do about Cleopatra and Caesarion. Some wanted her expelled immediately, viewing her as a dangerous symbol of monarchy and seduction. Others whispered of keeping her close, her wealth, her ships, her grain too valuable to risk alienating. But Cleopatra made the decision for them. When it became clear that Caesar's killers had the sympathy of powerful factions and that the tides of politics were growing too unstable, she quietly gathered her son and her court and prepared to leave. It was not a retreat, but a calculated exit. She did not beg. She did not plead for protection. She simply left Rome as she had arrived, in command of her own fate. Her departure was watched with a mixture of relief and regret. The queen had been the heart of every whisper for months, and now, like a ghost, she vanished back into the Mediterranean mist. Rome remained in chaos. Power vacuums deepened, and Cleopatra sailed home with a future as uncertain as the sea beneath her. The journey back to Alexandria was not peaceful. The sea that once carried her to Caesar's side now churned with memories and unspoken grief. She looked at Caesarion and saw both hope and danger. Her son was no longer merely her child. He was now the last living embodiment of Caesar's legacy. And that made him a target. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. Her enemies were not just those who had exiled her in the past, but the very idea of Rome itself. Back in Alexandria, she resumed her throne with the poise of someone who could not afford to mourn aloud. Egypt needed stability. It needed spectacle. It needed her to remain divine. She held court with renewed fervor, declared rituals in Caesar's honor, and aligned her son more deeply with Egyptian mythos. Caesarion was now Horus reborn, son of Isis and Osiris. Cleopatra became Isis incarnate once more, not as a metaphor, but as statecraft. Together, they represented continuity, resurrection, and divine right. The people embraced this with open arms. They had no love for Rome. They had no stake in its politics. But they had Cleopatra, and that was enough. Yet Cleopatra knew myth would not be enough to protect Caesarion. Not from Rome. Not from future ambition. She began to strengthen Egypt militarily, economically, and politically. She reached out to new allies, reinforced ties with the Nubians and the eastern satraps, and continued to amass wealth with the meticulous calculation of someone who expected siege, not peace. She observed the post-Caesar landscape carefully. Mark Antony emerged as a power player. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, began consolidating influence. Cleopatra watched both, saying nothing, but calculating everything. She understood that Rome would come calling again, and when it did, she would not answer with desperation, but with leverage. She fortified her navy. She invested in temple restorations, not for religion, but for loyalty. She elevated loyal families into key administrative roles and established surveillance over dissenters. She made Egypt not just beautiful again, but strong, all while Caesarion grew beside her. Educated by the finest minds, watched by priests and generals alike. He was being groomed for a world that would never accept him easily, but Cleopatra made sure he would never have to beg for acceptance. As the year waned, Cleopatra became more than just a queen. She was now a symbol of resistance, of endurance, of the feminine form of power that men feared because they could not control it. She wore the vulture crown not to intimidate, but to remind the world that she had outlasted every man who tried to unseat her. Her beauty was legendary, but her mind was terrifying. In 44 BCE, Cleopatra did not collapse beneath Caesar's death. She crystallized into something far more dangerous, a sovereign unanchored from any man's shadow. She no longer belonged to Rome or its politics. She belonged to Egypt, and to the future she was quietly shaping beneath the gold and grief. The world had expected her to vanish after Caesar. Instead, she stood taller. She did not write the next chapter of history that year, but she picked up the pen. In 41 BCE, after the tremors of Rome's recent civil wars had left empires shaking and thrones uncertain, Cleopatra VII sat once more in the heart of her palace in Alexandria, surrounded by silence not born of peace, but of calculation, memory, and the crackling of history rewriting itself again. For years had passed since Julius Caesar had been assassinated in Rome's marble halls, 4 years since the father of her son, the man who had once dared to dream of an empire with her at his side, had fallen beneath the blades of his own senate. Cleopatra had returned to Egypt in the ruins of that dream, not as a broken widow, but as a sovereign sharpening her crown against the stone of politics, building up her navy, her treasury, her child's education, and her myth. Caesarion was growing strong now, no longer the infant wrapped in the silks of Isis, but a child with the profile of Rome and the blood of the Nile, quiet, observant, and watched by every priest and soldier as if prophecy itself rested in his smile. Yet Cleopatra knew that Egypt's safety did not lie in borders, temples, or omens. It lived in alliances, in decisions made far beyond Alexandria, in Rome's shadow that reached across continents like a serpent seeking what it could strangle or seduce. And now Rome had split again. With Caesar dead, A fragile power balance had formed between his chosen heir Octavian, young, cold, calculating, and Mark Antony, his closest friend, his general, the man whose voice had turned Caesar's funeral into a revolt and whose heart still bled Rome's old courage. The third man in their uneasy triumvirate, Lepidus, was already fading into political insignificance, a ghost among wolves. Antony had taken command of the eastern provinces, where wealth and rebellion brewed in equal measure, and Egypt, though technically independent, was essential to Rome's grain, gold, and glory. Cleopatra had no illusions. Antony would call for her soon, not out of affection, but necessity. And when he did, she would not come crawling. She would make the world kneel. The summons came in autumn, formal, clipped, and as expected as the rise of the moon. Antony had settled in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, where his court swelled with generals, advisors, and flattery. He demanded Cleopatra explain her behavior during the Roman Civil War, specifically her lack of support for the triumvirate against the assassins of Caesar. It was a trap, a display of dominance, a test of her loyalty, an opportunity for Rome to show that even queens must answer to swords. But Cleopatra did not answer. She prepared. Over weeks, Alexandria stirred not with panic, but with performance. She ordered a magnificent barge built, layered in gold and scented with incense, its sails of purple silk billowing like the wings of divine vengeance. She adorned herself not merely as queen, but as Aphrodite reborn, goddess of love, of power, of irresistible fate. Her servants were dressed as cupids. Her musicians played only Egyptian flutes and lutes, harmonizing mystery with seduction. And when she sailed up the Cydnus River toward Tarsus, her arrival was not a visit. It was an invasion of the senses. Crowds gathered along the banks, whispering in awe, and even Antony's hardened soldiers fell silent as the queen's barge cut through the water, like a living myth. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of golden embroidery, her eyes heavy with kohl, her expression unreadable. She did not speak. She let her presence do the talking. And Antony, brave, bold, victorious Antony, felt the weight of her before she said a word. Their first meeting in Tarsus is lost to time and detail, but preserved forever in consequence. Cleopatra entered Antony's court not as a subordinate, but as a storm. He had expected apology, perhaps bribes, maybe tears. What he received was an equal. She addressed him as Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and war, a name that flattered and challenged, that invoked intoxication and chaos. Antony, used to the blunt loyalty of soldiers and the false smiles of senators, was immediately disarmed. Cleopatra offered no gifts, only alliances, no submission, only partnership. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that Egypt had always served Rome's interests, but only when Rome respected Egypt's sovereignty. She presented herself not as a woman begging for favor, but as a ruler offering opportunity. Together, she said, they could restore order to the East, Rome through power, Egypt through vision. That night, they dined together beneath stars that had once witnessed Caesar's whispers, but now listened to something rawer. Two people not mourning the past, but sculpting the future with every look, every syllable, every unspoken promise. Their affair, if one dares to reduce it to that word, began not in passion, but in parallel wounds. Both had lost more than power in the recent wars. They had lost direction, companionship, mirrors. Antony, though still powerful, felt the cold grip of Rome's judgment, the thinly veiled scorn of Octavian back in the West, the creeping suspicion that he was being outmaneuvered in politics even as he triumphed in battles. Cleopatra, though adorned with gold and prophecy, knew that her rule would never be safe while Caesarion's legitimacy hung in the balance, while Rome still debated her place as a monarch and a woman. Together, they found not only attraction, but an alliance that fed something deeper, trust. Cleopatra returned with Antony to Alexandria not just in love, but in purpose. She welcomed him into her world with open gates and open hands. The court adjusted to him, but never bowed. He was her equal, not her master. They hunted together in the Delta marshes, drank wine by torchlight, played games of strategy and wit in the palace chambers. And always beneath the laughter was the planning. Antony began using Alexandria as a base for his eastern campaigns. Cleopatra funded his armies, provided ships, reinforced alliances with nearby kingdoms, and together they charted a new geopolitical path, one where East and West would not be rivals, but partners ruled by two thrones, not one. To the outside world, their relationship was scandal, seduction, sin. Roman poets mocked Antony as bewitched, conquered not by armies, but by eyeliner and perfume. The Senate began murmuring that he was betraying Roman values, that he no longer remembered the Republic, only a queen's smile. But inside Alexandria, the world bloomed. Art flourished, science was sponsored, temples were restored. Cleopatra's Egypt entered another golden phase, not only sustained by power, but elevated by culture. Together, she and Antony formed a society where love and law, ambition and architecture, war and wisdom coexisted beneath the blue gaze of Ra and the patient stars. Cleopatra bore twins, a boy and a girl, named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, sun and moon, born to balance the world. Their births were announced with celestial metaphor, with hymns and festivals, not as royal children, but as omens of a new dynasty. Cleopatra, now mother of 3 royal children tied to both Rome and Egypt, stood at the zenith of her power. Antony, though still tethered to Rome's obligations and married to Octavia, Octavian's sister, seemed increasingly willing to drift toward the life Cleopatra offered, one of legacy, of mythology, of partnership not in name but in destiny. Yet even as love bloomed in Alexandria's gardens, the storm clouds thickened across the Mediterranean. Octavian watched from Rome with cold patience. He knew Antony's weakness was not war, but love. He let the rumors fester, the Senate whisper, the people gossip. He painted Cleopatra as a sorceress, Antony as a traitor. He let time do his work. But Cleopatra, in 41 BC, did not fear Octavian, not yet. Her mind was too focused on building, on protecting, on ensuring that Caesarion would grow not in shadows, but in sunlight, that her children would inherit not conflict, but legacy. She built monuments that etched their names beside hers. She commissioned scrolls that detailed their lineage, their right to rule, their divinity. And at night, when the court slept and Antony rested beside her, she would walk the palace corridors barefoot, touching the walls like a priestess, whispering prayers not to gods, but to time. She knew history was watching. She could feel it. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a force of political gravity. She had survived Caesar. She had mastered Egypt. And now, with Antony by her side, she was daring to imagine a world reborn, not through conquest, but through unity, not through the old ways, but through a new empire built on vision, not vengeance. It would not last. The world was not yet ready. But for a moment, just a moment, Cleopatra stood at the summit of love, power, and myth. And the world, caught between stars and sand, bowed in awe. In the year 31 BCE, the skies over Alexandria darkened not with storm but with the weight of inevitability as Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, goddess in the flesh, and mother of an empire in waiting, stood at the precipice of her greatest gamble, unraveling into a tragedy written across the stars. For nearly a decade, she had ruled not just alongside Mark Antony, but with him as partner, lover, co-sovereign, and architect of a dream meant to unite East and West in glory, ambition, and divine blood. They had birthed children who bore the names of celestial bodies, erected monuments that intertwined their fates with myth, and ruled empires not from within Rome's brittle republic, but from the radiant corridors of Egyptian power. But all empires built on dreams eventually meet the cold resistance of the waking world, and now, as Rome under Octavian hardened into singularity, the dream Cleopatra and Antony had forged began to splinter, not from lack of love, but from the tightening grip of reality. Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar and the silent serpent of Roman politics, had spent years watching, waiting, letting his enemies hang themselves with garlands they mistook for laurels. He knew that Antony's alliance with Cleopatra, no matter how politically strategic or emotionally profound, could be weaponized in the court of Roman opinion. And so he poisoned the well, slowly. He whispered to the Senate that Antony had given away Roman lands to a foreign woman, had raised his bastard children as rulers of territories that did not belong to them, had fallen under the spell of a temptress who dressed as Isis and crowned herself more than mortal. Rome, ever prideful and xenophobic, stirred with outrage. The fact that Antony had legally divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister, only added oil to the fire. Honor was invoked. Duty was paraded. But beneath all that smoke, it was always about power, and Octavian was ready to strike. Cleopatra, aware of Rome's turning tide, doubled down on magnificence. She was not a woman to plead for mercy. She was a queen who prepared for war. Her navy grew, her soldiers drilled beneath the Egyptian sun, and her palace shimmered with preparations that masked the growing unease in her heart. She still believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that with Antony by her side, they could face any army. But Antony, for all his courage, was not the man he once was. The years had dulled his clarity. His loyalty remained, but his judgment frayed beneath the strain of defending both love and power. He began listening too closely to flatterers, too little to generals. Cleopatra saw it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the heavy silence after councils, the way he sometimes stared out across the harbor as if trying to measure a future slipping through his fingers. Still, she did not abandon him. She strengthened the image of their unity with public rituals, held their children in her arms during festivals, and reminded Egypt and Rome that this was not a fleeting affair, but a dynasty being born beneath sun and sea. But the world beyond Egypt's borders was closing in. Octavian had rallied his forces and framed the conflict not as civil war, but as a defense of Rome itself against Eastern corruption, against a queen who would dare replace the Senate with silks and incense. By the time Antony and Cleopatra moved their combined forces to Actium, a narrow strait on the western coast of Greece, it was not just a strategic decision, it was a desperate one. There, at the edge of the known world, they would make their stand, not only for their reigns, but for the entire vision they had built together. The preparations for Actium were monumental. Cleopatra brought with her a vast fleet of Egyptian warships, sleek, fast, and armed with the pride of the Nile. Antony, for his part, commanded Roman legions loyal to his name, if not his strategy. Yet even as they prepared, divisions grew. Commanders disagreed. Morale wavered. Disease whispered through camps. And the winds, those ever-symbolic winds, seemed to turn against them before the first arrow flew. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, began harassing their supply lines, cutting off escape routes, slowly strangling their options. Cleopatra urged a withdrawal to Egypt, where their forces could regroup, where she could rally her people, where they might turn a retreat into a rebirth. But Antony, proud and cornered, refused. He could not bear the stain of retreat. He believed one decisive naval battle could end the war. Cleopatra, loving him still, deferred. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium began beneath a sun that offered no warmth, only exposure. Cleopatra's fleet was stationed behind Antony's, forming a second wave, her sails catching wind, her colors bold and unmistakable. The sea swelled with the iron breath of war. But what unfolded was not glory, it was chaos. Agrippa's ships, lighter and better coordinated, outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Confusion spread. Orders were lost in the din. Cleopatra, watching from her flagship, saw the tide turn and made a choice that would echo forever. She turned her ships, fled the battle line, and sailed for the open sea, a signal both of retreat and survival. Antony, upon seeing her departure, followed, not with strategy, but with his heart. He abandoned the fight, pursued her through the breaking waves, leaving his legions behind, leaving history behind. Their return to Alexandria was not triumphant. It was quiet, mournful, the silence between them heavier than any throne. Antony, once a lion of Rome, now walked the palace halls as a man caught between shame and sorrow. Cleopatra, though shaken, refused to let the dream die. She negotiated. She wrote letters. She sent envoys to Octavian offering her throne, her treasures, even her exile, if only her children could be spared. She offered to abdicate in favor of Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, whom she still believed might claim a place in the new world Octavian sought to rule. Octavian responded not with terms, but with silence and ships. He did not want negotiation, he wanted a stage. He began his final march on Egypt in the summer of 30 BCE, his armies sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean like a judgment long postponed. As he approached Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared one final deception. She constructed a mausoleum, grand, golden, a shrine to her own death. She filled it with treasures, with relics of her reign, with letters and memories. And in it, she planned to die on her own terms, if need be. Antony, misled by a rumor that Cleopatra had already taken her life, fell upon his own sword in despair. Bleeding, broken, he was brought to her, not in triumph, but in twilight. He died in her arms, whispering her name, a final echo of a love that had defied empires, but not time. Cleopatra, now truly alone, watched as Octavian entered Alexandria not as a guest, but as a god of war. She met him, not as a beggar, but as a queen. She wore her finest robes. She spoke with calm. She did not plead. She negotiated. She tried, one last time, to barter her legacy for her children's lives. Octavian listened, cool and unreadable. He promised nothing. She knew, then, that her story was ending, not in surrender, but in sacrifice. Days later, she locked herself in her mausoleum, dismissed her servants, and prepared for eternity. Whether it was the ASP, or poison, or a ritual known only to her priests, the world may never know. But when Octavian's men broke in, Cleopatra lay serene beside her two most trusted handmaidens, her body adorned as Isis, her eyes closed not in fear, but in finality. She was 39 years old. Her reign, the last of the Ptolemies, had ended not with defeat, but with defiance. Octavian, now Augustus, took Egypt as his prize, renamed it a Roman province, erased her children's claims, and marched triumphantly into history. But Cleopatra became something more. She became legend, not just for her beauty or her lovers, but for her courage, her mind, her refusal to bend beneath the tides of men. In 31 BC, the world witnessed the beginning of her fall. But in that fall, she rose beyond empire, beyond time, beyond the reach of Rome itself. And there, in the quiet between memory and myth, she still reigns. In the scorching, dust-hung summer of 30 BCE, Alexandria held its breath, its once vibrant streets dimmed under the thundercloud of Rome's final march, as Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, the last divine voice of Isis, the last breath of a dying dynasty, felt the shadows of the inevitable crawl slowly over her golden palace. It had all unraveled faster than even time could mourn. Less than a year before, she had stood at the height of a divine alliance, ruling hand in hand with Mark Antony, commander of Roman legions, father to 3 of her children, her final great love. Together they had defied the world's borders and dared to challenge the great Octavian, Caesar's heir, the cold flame of the Roman Republic's last warlord. But now, that flame had grown into a funeral pyre. The Battle of Actium had stolen their hopes, their fleets broken, their commanders fled, and the spirit of their cause pierced like a lung under siege. Antony had returned to Alexandria empty, bitter, hollow, and ashamed, his pride bleeding in places even Cleopatra could not reach, while she, ever the sovereign, clung to silence, to strategy, and to the last whispers of survival. Rome had never just been an enemy to her. It had been a prophecy circling her since childhood, since her father's throne, since Caesar's kiss. And now it came not with diplomacy or deceit, but with 30,000 armored men, marching like fate down the Nile, with Octavian himself at the helm. In these final days, Cleopatra wore her crown like a weapon, her silks like scars, and moved through her palace as if memorizing every shadow, her footsteps echoing through halls lined with statues of gods who had long since stopped answering prayers. She tried, as she always had, to turn the tide, not with armies now, but with brilliance. She sent envoys to Octavian, promising treasures, bargaining her throne, even offering her own life in exchange for her children's safety. She knew him, or thought she did. Knew he was not a man given to emotion or flattery, but to calculation. She hoped that logic would prevail where love and pride had failed. Her most loyal servants watched her soften her voice for the enemy, the same voice that once commanded priests and generals alike, and they said nothing, not because they believed her lies would work, but because they knew she had no other weapons left. Yet Octavian was unmoved. He had already decided the narrative. Cleopatra, the foreign queen who poisoned Rome with perfumes and seduction, who birthed bastard heirs in silk cradles, who corrupted noble Mark Antony with dancing girls and Egyptian wine, would not be remembered as a sovereign or strategist, but as a cautionary tale. He wanted her alive, caged, humiliated, paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains, dragged through the forum while crowds spat her name. That was the price of mercy, a legacy broken, a goddess made spectacle. But Cleopatra, who had lived every year with history's ink soaking through her skin, could never allow that. Her soul had walked too close to myth to end in mockery. So, in those final weeks, as Alexandria fell inch by inch, as Rome's banners darkened the city's skyline, she began preparing not for defeat, but for death. Not as an escape, but as a final, sovereign act. Then came the blade that broke what remained. Mark Antony, her lion, her ruin, her flawed beloved, misled by a false report that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, threw himself upon his sword in a moment of unbearable grief, hoping to meet her in death if not in victory. The wound was not clean. It gushed slowly, agonizing, refusing to offer him the mercy he had sought. His attendants, panicked and broken, carried him to her, bleeding, weeping, still whispering her name as if it were the only prayer that could hold back the night. Cleopatra, when she saw him, did not scream. She did not wail. She held him, silently. Her gold-draped arms soaked in blood that no empire could wash away. She kissed his forehead and told him he was not defeated. Not in her eyes. She whispered stories of the world they'd built, of the children he had given her, of how Rome would never understand them because it could never feel what they felt. He died with his head on her lap. In that moment, the queen ceased to exist. What remained was a woman stripped of her last ally, her last illusion. But even as she crumbled inside, her face remained unshaken. She had one task left. Octavian entered Alexandria days later, not as a liberator, but as a collector of spoils. He claimed Antony's body, gave it the funeral rites that befitted a Roman general, and summoned Cleopatra to appear before him. She did, cloaked in black, but crowned still. The weight of her grief did not dull the sharpness of her tongue. She tried once more to speak of peace, of her children, of diplomacy. But Octavian listened as one listens to a ghost. He had no intention of letting her vanish into history as a martyr. She would be displayed, publicly, brutally, as a lesson carved in flesh. Cleopatra, understanding finally that no amount of dignity would spare her legacy from mutilation, asked only one thing: time. Time to mourn. Time to say goodbye to her children. Time to bury a lover. He granted it, perhaps believing that death could wait a few more days. But Cleopatra had already chosen the hour of her passing. She returned to her mausoleum, the same one she had built as a tomb and throne alike, and there, in chambers lit only by oil lamps and memories, she dismissed all but her most faithful handmaidens. She gathered her symbols, gold, scrolls, relics of her father, of Caesar, of Antony. She wrote letters, perhaps to Octavian, perhaps to Caesarion, perhaps to time itself. And then, in a room heavy with jasmine and tears, she lay on her deathbed and summoned the ASP. The means of her death remained debated. Was it the ASP, biting beneath a fig basket? Was it poison hidden in a hairpin? Was it ritual? Was it divine? What history agrees on is this: Cleopatra died with her face composed, her body arranged like a goddess in repose, her final act one of total control. She had ruled, she had loved, she had lost, but she had never yielded. Not to Rome, not to men, not to fear. Her handmaidens, loyal to the very last breath, died beside her. When Octavian soldiers arrived, they found her wrapped in linen and silence, not like a prisoner, but like a queen receiving eternity. She was 39 years old. Her reign had lasted 22 years. Her name would outlive every senator who cursed her. Her tomb was sealed. Her children, some killed, some taken to Rome, one lost forever in the shuffle of empire. Caesarion, the last blood heir of Julius Caesar, was murdered on Octavian's quiet orders, an act of politics dressed as necessity. With that, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian became Augustus. The world turned. But Cleopatra became myth. Her life, etched in the sand and stone of every generation since, became not just a story of a queen, but a lesson in sovereignty, in the cost of ambition, in the beauty and brutality of power. She was not perfect. She was political, manipulative, brilliant, flawed. But she was never small, never invisible. She was the storm beneath history's surface, the echo in the marble halls of power. And in the silence after her death, Rome did not roar. It listened. It knew that it had not just defeated a woman. It had witnessed the end of an era. Cleopatra died not because she lost, but because she refused to surrender. And that is how legends are born, not in triumph, but in the way a soul chooses to meet its end. And that was the untold, emotional journey of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her story wasn't just about love or politics. It was about legacy, power, and the price of defiance. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more raw and powerful history like this. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a legend, and comment below, was Cleopatra a ruler ahead of her time, or simply a woman trapped in it? Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.